that should be us ready. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along to our session today. We're going to be talking about avoiding the disconnect, connecting better to support an inclusive-based approach. I will be chairing today's session, and we have 3 wonderful speakers as well, 1 guest speaker, and I will be talking a little bit about them. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction, let you guys know who we are, why we're here, and then I will pass straight on to our speakers. And let's get to it, shall we? So, okay, so webinar program, first of all, welcome. We're going to be talking about the protocols, the usual kind of housekeeping stuff. Meet the team, also what our outcomes are. And then Bill Colley is going to be speaking about a case study. And then we have Professor Jean MacLellan, and then we have Tom and his work in Australia. We also have 7 people streaming from Australia who couldn't access the Zoom link, so they are streaming through Tom's computer. So there's a lot more people here than you would think. We are going to have some time for questions, and we are also going to have a break. We will send you a copy of these slides today, and we will also send you a recording of the webinar as a private YouTube link so that you can see it. So if you have to leave for any point, or there's any reason why you need to take a call, don't worry about it. We will make sure you get a copy of these slides. I should also say, this is a neurodivergent-led organisation. So, you know, there's a lot of ADHD going on in this webinar. So bear with us if we get distracted, or, and I am also dyslexic, so I might struggle with reading out loud. We wanted to say that there are some trigger warnings around some of these topics due to some really harrowing case studies we're going to be talking about, but I think it's important that we do identify these. So we have suicide, we have bereavement, violence, and mental illness. We will also be at the end of all of the slides. I have made a list of recommended signposting for anyone who's struggling with any of these. So that includes organisations for each of these themes. So if you do want to know more or access something local, then please do contact any of the services that we have signposted to. Okay, so webinar etiquette. If you can mute your microphone while you're not speaking, that just helps us with the background noise. It's your choice whether you have your video on and off. I know for some people they don't have a choice today because technology has not been on their side. Please ask a question in the chat box, but honestly, like, because it's quite a small group, we would love to hear from you. So if you would like to say something out loud, we would like that as well. What I'm going to do is throughout the conversation, I'm going to be looking in the chat and responding to people and getting back to people and using that information. How it's going to work with the questions is we're going to hear from each case study, and if there's questions that are relevant to the specific case study, we will speak about that at the time. And then at the very end of the session, if there are some more broad questions, I will be writing those down, keeping an eye on them, and we will be talking about the webinar as a whole in relevance to the questions. We always say, you know, be polite and respectful, and we will save the chat box. So if there's anything we've missed or there's anything you want more information about, please do put it in the chat and we will make sure we will get back to you. Okay, so meet the team. Who are the team? I have a little biography for all of you. So let's talk about Bill first. So Bill's going to be going first today. So Bill's background is in education. He's a writer, teacher, trainer, and education consultant. And he's also a trained diagnostic assessor for ADIR and ADOS. And he's been an expert witness in both civil and criminal cases, as well as being an advocate for families accessing specialist services. He's currently chair of the Scottish ADHD charity and vice president of UCAP. So he's a busy man, he's an experienced man. And he's got a really interesting case study today as well. Myself, I've created a group of training programs for health, social care and education. I primarily work with children and young people with additional support needs, predominantly around neurodivergency and relationships, sexual health and parenthood. And then we have Tom. Tom will be speaking today. He'll be the last speaker. He's an international award-winning advocate with specialist advocacy knowledge within education, social care, employment, and the welfare system. Tom is also the chair of the International Advocacy Practitioners Association, the Research and Reflecting Learning Subcommittee, and he also serves as an independent advisor to a range of third sector community groups or organisations both in Scotland and beyond. The case study he's going to be showing is the international case study, so it'll be really fascinating to see that. And then we have our very special guest today, Jean, who also used to be my boss, and Professor Jean MacLellan OBE. She's a professor of education at University of Strathclyde, and she was also the director of Autism Network Scotland. She was previously deputy director in the Health and Social Care Integration Directorate in Scottish Government. She led policy development on adult protection legislation and on self-directed support. She was awarded an OBE in 2012 for services to the government. Jean was the independent review for the Margaret Flemming Significant Case Review, which we'll be talking about today. So we have a wealth of information in this role, an enormous amount of expertise, and I'm really excited to see what comes our way. Now, who are we as a team? So who are AISee? So AISee, stands for Advocacy, Identify, Solutionize, Educate, and Empower. We are three individuals who know each other well, who come from quite varied backgrounds, but all have lived experience and practitioner experience in supporting often the most vulnerable people in our society. You know, the people who have slipped through the gaps, the people who are very complex cases, and we wanted to join together our expertise. And what it originally started off with is we wanted to do training, and we are primarily a training collaborative, but you know, we all have ideas and we all have ADHD, so we've come up with some ideas along the way, and we're currently working on a couple of really exciting projects. I think what we like is that the idea of avoiding the disconnect between identifying the needs of the individual and matching it to the skills and knowledge of practitioners is something that we care about passionately. So we're really excited to see what you guys think as well. I should also say, if you would be interested in getting an accreditation for this webinar, we can get that. There is a small price. Is it £15, Tom, from ITOL? Yep. So we are an ITOL accredited centre. So if you are looking to get a certificate for today's webinar, then please do get in touch, and for £15 we can do that for you. That's just an admin fee on their side as well. And the webinars and objectives. So today we're going to be exploring the big questions and talking about the importance of connection, cohesion, and partnerships. And I think all of the cases that we're going to be talking about today show not only the impact it can make to have these positive connections, but also what happens when they're not there and the impact it can make on an individual. We'll be talking about prevention, safeguarding and supports, and learning from the case studies, as well as insights from Jean, and also kind of gain knowledge of the benefits and the impacts of these case studies. I think because all of these case studies are very specific, but share the same goal of working together. I think we were talking about, actually, Tom and Bill, yesterday, about how sometimes in Scotland a lot of red tape gets in the way, a lot of bureaucracy, but sometimes picking up the phone and having a conversation with someone can be the most powerful way to support someone. So we're going to be talking about that through today's session. And we're going to be talking about the positive side of it as well. So the awareness, the referral systems, the assessments, the partnerships, the impact, the benefits of the stuff that we've done, and the interventions that we've also dealt with ourselves. So it's not going to be all doom and gloom. We are going to be talking about some really powerful learning points from all three of these cases. Now, I am going to be the timekeeper. So apologies, Jean, Bill, and Tom, if I say to you, hello, it's time for you to move on a little bit. So at the moment, Bill, it is 10:16. So you're going to have half an hour to do your session. And it's time for me to pass on to Bill. Now, I am going to be the clicker. So Bill, just let me know when you would like me to click on, and I'm going to stop talking and let Bill do his thing. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Corey. I hope everyone can hear me. Good morning to folk in the UK. Good evening to folk the other side of the world. We're looking, I need to say at the outset, this is a series case review on a 17-year-old young person. I declare an interest or several interests in that the local authority that was involved in this. I was the additional support needs manager for that authority prior to this incident occurring, and I had involvement with the family during the period that we're discussing, and in fact afterwards as well. So whilst I will be drawing primarily upon the review that was conducted by the local authority, there's other information that will be included. And I want to say at the outset that this is not about attributing blame in any way at all. If anything, it's about realizing that in circumstances like this, there is often an unhappy coincidence of multiple risks and vulnerabilities which contribute to an event like this occurring. And that we've got to be very careful about using terms like causation, where the subject matter is so complex as a young person, and mental health and suicide in particular. So this isn't an attempt at pointing the finger of blame. It's more about careful consideration of the circumstances in which this unfortunate situation arose. So Corey, if you can move on to the next slide, we'll deal with this very quickly. This is where I'm heading. The consideration of the review findings, some analysis, super analysis from the review, and then looking at the barriers, challenges, and opportunities, and recognizing the financial, cultural, and structural barriers that may prevent the type of collaborative working that could mitigate against the risks that have been identified. Yeah, we're not saying, I don't think at any point we will say that this could have been avoided. I don't think at any point we're saying that this young person's very complex problems could have been solved. But what we're doing is trying to reduce risk and assess and identify risk, which is in itself a tremendous problem. As someone who worked in the local authority with 19,000 young people, I took it upon myself to find out if there was any system that could be put in place to identify high-risk individuals. And we did do that through data analysis. But even if you were to identify a group of young people who you think might be suicide risks, as an education officer, you don't really have the expertise to do that. And you're never going to catch everyone who, unfortunately, is going to make an attempt at their own life. So there are also caveats in what's being said. If you can click to the next slide, please. So the background is that this young person had been placed at an independent special school, which is where the incident occurred. The family had put in a placing request, which was rejected, and then the family had to take the local authority to the tribunal. They won at tribunal, and he started at the school sometime in 2015, I think it was. In February 2017, he absented himself from a class at school at the end of the school day and took his own life. The school staff attempted to revive him, but were unsuccessful. And there were a lot of issues around how the school managed that crisis. And that analysis was done in school, and some very interesting lessons were learned. But they're not the subject matter of this, because the primary focus is on other agencies and how perhaps other agencies didn't work together as effectively as they might have done. So click to the next slide, please. So most of this information then is taken from the serious case review itself, conducted by the local authority. In one or two of the slides, I have put my own text, and I will highlight that so that we can discriminate between what has come from the review team and what's come from me. But some of the significant points that, and bear in mind, we're only dipping in to various parts of the review, so we're not going to read through the whole review. But one of the first things that leapt out to me was that this young person in primary school, the primary school education did not identify any additional support needs. And he was relatively successful in the primary school, but the needs hadn't been identified. And yet later on, he's diagnosed with ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, and then an emerging gender dysphoria in his teenage years. But the transition from primary to secondary was not successful. and he didn't attend school. There are a number of contributory factors which are quite significant. And the question arises, and I think it's worth asking, is that if his needs had been identified at primary, would an enhanced transition have led to a more successful placement at secondary school? Question mark. I'm not forming that judgment. I'm just floating that as a question. So the risk factors involved at the time were an experience of childhood trauma. His mother was in an abusive relationship. She had to move out of the family home. They had to move out of the family home. They had to live in refuges and various multiple locations, which is incredibly unsettling for anybody. But if we think about some of the anxiety issues associated with autism and ADHD in particular, the multiple transitions that will have been necessary, the sensory challenges, the social challenges that young person would have faced. You can see what's coming together at this stage is various threads of vulnerability and intertwining, coming together to make this young person really quite vulnerable. So there's the delay in diagnosis and assessment, a long assessment process, which again contributes to the vulnerability of young people and the vulnerability of families to support young people. So he's neurodivergent, he's got gender dysphoria, and he's not attending school, he's socially isolated. So a very unhappy situation until the placing request is successful, and then he is able to start at this independent, small independent special school where he thrives. So if you can move on to the next slide. I may skip over some of this because I think it's self-explanatory, but he settles into school and develops friendships. So after 2 weeks at the school, he said to his mother, "Can I have a phone?" Mother said, "Why? You've never wanted a phone before." And he said, "Because for the first time I have friends. I've got friends. I want a phone," which is lovely. But again, I think sometimes we take the positives, and clearly it's extraordinarily positive that he's attending school full time. He's fully engaged in the life of the school. He's very able young. He's just come out as trans, so he's now referred to by his male name, and he's accepted. It was very inclusive sort of community. He's fully involved in things like expressive arts. Yeah, he performs on stage. He had a particular talent for performing on stage. He wrote poetry and won an award for his poetry. So when we look at it in a simplistic way, everything's going fine. He had this huge set of problems up until the point where he's integrating into school. School has now become a safe place because of all the uncertainty of what was happening to the family. It's as if an anchor has been dropped down by being part of the school. However, from my experience of working with children in this situation, what you get is a paradox of a young person who suddenly discovers that they can have friends, but because they haven't really had a chance to develop the social skills, it's very up and down. They will have intense friendships, which then collapse, and it's that sort of story. So it's a bit of the paradox of success. And you're now being socially successful, but you're also making mistakes, and things fluctuate. And with this young person, what I think comes through from my own personal knowledge and from the serious case review is this idea of fluctuating mental health. It's not about a static condition. It's about periods of time when he would be very, very happy, even ecstatic, and other periods of time when he would be depressed and withdrawn. And how professionals around him work, school staff, for example, how they work with that when they're really not entirely sure what the factors are contributing to his current presentation. So if you go on to the next slide, Corey. So so despite the fact that we've got the relative success of him finally being placed in the school where he's learning and he is integrated and is included, he's got a number of other problems which may be unrelated, and probably were unrelated to school itself, from sleep disruption, which is massively debilitating for young people, feeling overwhelmed. And part of the feeling of being overwhelmed was the fact that he'd missed so much schooling. And yet now he was going to be in S5, I think at the time, having to take certificate exams, external exams, and with the not knowing what was going to happen next. So he's in, even though he's gone through this very disruptive period prior to joining the school, he's now in the school, but already looming on the horizon is what happens next, and the pressure of exams. And in addition to this, he's got this very strong, passionate drive towards gender reassignment, which is not being met by the medical profession. By that, I mean the pace of change is not being met. So appointments are being cancelled. And this, of course, is a very tricky and contentious area, because how fast should you go? Should you allow time for young people to pause and reflect and to really develop a certainty? For this young person, they were absolutely certain. And it went to the extent of trying to change their physical appearance using binders, dressing differently. It was one of the rare, very obvious cases to me of genuine gender dysphoria, and yet he felt that he wasn't being supported. And I know, Corey, you're pushing me on, but I think the other issue is that it's very difficult for young people in Scotland to access mental health professionals with expertise in gender dysphoria. So that you can go to the CALMS clinic, but very often they're dealing with a set of routine cases of autism diagnosis, ADHD diagnosis, and then some of the acute mental health problems associated with children's mental health. But there's very little opportunity. They don't have the resources, and this isn't a blame game, but they don't have the resources to take a more considered and long-term approach with a continual keeping in touch, keeping advice going. And so eventually this young person was discharged by CALMS, and it was on the basis that he wasn't taking his ADHD medication. And that discharge of the patient took place very shortly before he took his own life. And social work support was also withdrawn. So we can see, again, if you think of these threads coming together, there are 2 or 3 more threads in the withdrawal of support, the frustration, the gender assignment, the pressure of exams, et cetera, et cetera. So next slide, please. Again, from so at this stage, the school are starting to recognize another risk factor, which I'll come on to, and that the family are saying that although he's happy at school, his mental health is very, very fragile. It's again, an odd paradoxical situation. Happy and settled, but starting to display some quite concerning features of mental health. And the young man himself talking about the pressure of exams, the frustration with gender reassignment. So the family and the young person and the school said this young person needs to be at school for another year in terms of his stability. He'd missed so much schooling before. He just really started to integrate and was progressing well in his academically, but he'd missed so much, and he was playing catch up all the time. So they put in for funding, and that funding was rejected by the local authority on the grounds that you leave school at 18. And at this point, I think, having been an education officer, we need to recognize the budgetary constraints, the pressures that are placed on education officers when they're making decisions. Sorry about my dog barking, Bill. This isn't any criticism of the decision that was taken, and the decision was taken very quickly, because it was only based, the criteria was that he was 18, or he's coming up to 18, sorry, he was 17, coming up to 18. He'd started attending college for an afternoon a week. Therefore, college would be his next option, and he would leave school. There would be no more funding. And it was only 3 days after that he took his own life. So the degree to which we can say that was a major factor, we can't say it was a major, it probably was. We can certainly say it's likely that it contributed to his decision. And if we turn on to the next slide. So just summarizing the risks that were emerging at the time. And the Yes, I was going to say the final one, but it depends how you look at the diagram, obviously. But what the school was also noticing was that he was starting to complain about hearing voices and seeing things. Now, that to me, from my background in children's mental health, is a big red flag, because it suggests, certainly at the age of 18, that these may have been prodromal symptoms of a fairly serious mental health condition like schizophrenia, for example, which required expert analysis and intervention. This wasn't one occasion, it wasn't on two occasions, it was on several occasions. The information was passed on. There was an assumption from the school that the parents would address this through mental health, because that seemed to be the standard route, and there was no direct mechanism for the school to contact CALMS directly. And in fact, at local authority level, where there had been a hotline previously, that no longer existed because the lead clinician had moved, and the opportunity for a senior education officer in a local authority to phone up CALMS and say, we need some help. This goes beyond our professional competence, and it may go beyond your professional competence as well, but between us, or with the support of a fourth tier service, we may be able to get some understanding of what's going on here. And I'm going to come back at the end to the importance of that type of communication. It doesn't necessarily require a system. It requires a type of relationship and the opportunity, the feeling of mutual professional respect, whereby that education officer is not going to be picking up the phone every morning to phone CALMS about some crisis in the education authority, but they are going to do it on those rare occasions, particularly where complexity arises and where other professionals need to work together, which is a theme that emerges from this serious case review. So if you go on to the next slide, just to summarize, the authority refuses to place a request, and the pupil is notified during the midterm break. He returns to school, and on the first day, he takes his own life. So next slide. Some of the conclusions and findings this is from the review, it's not from me, that concerns, and I think you can probably, having heard what I've said so far, you could almost write these conclusions yourself about silo working, about the lack of recognition of changing risk, how risks are identified. And let us not be naive and suggest that there is a system for identifying young people at suicide risk. Otherwise, it would be being used. It's more about the quality of communication that various people around this young person can pull together to say, hang on, this is ringing some alarm bells for me. And I'm not suggesting that this incident could have been averted. I'm probably suggesting, as the review was, that the risks of it occurring could perhaps have been reduced. But we're not talking about a situation where we say A caused B. What we're saying is that A to Z contributed to what happened. And I think if we move on to the next slide, where it looks at this complex narrative that was being relayed, and he was expressing also, he had a blog, he had a YouTube channel, and he comes across as a wonderfully sparky young individual who shares some of his concerns online. It is clearly engaged with an online community, but an online community also that was relatively uncontrolled and unregulated. Or the contact was uncontrolled and unregulated. So there is a very good chance that the belief is he learned the technique of how to take his own life online. And it may have been glamorized, it may have been encouraged. There was no real investigation into that. But he's clearly seeking help and seeking contact elsewhere, perhaps in lieu of the fact that the questions that he had arising in his mind were not being addressed through the professionals involved. So next slide, and tell me how I'm doing for time.
You're doing phenomenally. Tom has said in the comments, Bill, it might be worth explaining the acronyms of CCRs and IRDs.
Oh yes, an IRD is a meeting of independent. It's a review of risk around a child. So an IRD meeting will be held by Child Protection, and it's an initial review of a situation. It's not. It's where you identify if there are child protection issues, if there are significant risks involved, and it should involve health, sometimes the police, but education as well. And those IRD meetings were not taking place. They were not taking place in the way perhaps they should have been, and the school was not involved.
Right.
And I think that probably one of the things that I would add into this review is a feeling that the family perhaps was seen as resource hungry in terms of budgets, because what they were asking for was probably 30,000, 40,000 pounds of funding for a school placement. And if you think of it in those terms, then that's a real nuisance as a budget holder. If your line manager is putting pressure on you to cut your budget and to get young people away from out of authority placements and specialist placements and integrated into mainstream, that pressure, I know because I was there, that pressure undoubtedly exists. And whether that was a factor in the decision not to grant an extra year at the school is something that only the local authority will know. So I think when we look at the other case studies, words like fragmented, inconsistent, uncoordinated are probably going to come through. But I return to a rhetorical question, which we're not going to answer, which is about this. How do you identify these high-risk young people? And how do you intervene meaningfully with them in a collaborative way between the various partners? In this case, the school, the family, any other agencies involved. And it's not a question that can be answered by you just do X, Y, or Z. It requires quite a lot of thinking and a lot of thinking around professional relationships. So if you go on to the next slide. Yeah, so there's some criticisms within CALMS itself about not identifying the need. If you go on to the next slide, I think is the one I'm no, it's okay. But there was a lot of very good reflection within CALMS, and they talk about some of their systemic problems, which situational problems, which were changes in personnel, a lot of locum professionals being involved, people moving away who had professional expertise and that expertise not being replaced. Difficulties because of the pressure of work, difficulties in knowing who to talk to within a local authority about a concern, or even if they should, because there are issues around information sharing, which can't just be swept under the carpet by saying, yes, where there is risk of harm, you can share information. It's more troubling to a professional working in that capacity than you can't just pick up the phone and share information. You've got to do some thinking around that. So what I would do, and this is some of my thoughts, is that again, one of the first things to consider is this review is published in June 2022, and yet the young person took their life in February 2008. It's a 5-year wait for a review which identifies some fairly significant systemic problems within the working around this young person, and maybe the cultural barrier. By that I mean the professional cultural barriers of saying, well, this is a mental health problem, so it's nothing to do with education, or the mental health professional saying this is a problem about schooling, or it's about the family, so it's a social. The true Gerfeck model was not really pulling together people in a way that was gave opportunities for A, understanding the set of risks involved, and B, mitigating them, and that I think was part of the problem. If you can go back, yeah, the exclusion of key partners in the review itself. So this review was produced and the school wasn't involved, even though they had pretty intimate knowledge of the issues involved. and the family weren't involved in the review. So it seems quite extraordinary that a review can be conducted around what was a very serious case without the family having their say. And I'm not suggesting that the findings would necessarily have been different, but there might have been more findings.
Can I ask, Bill, why do you think it is that the family and the school weren't involved?
I think I don't know. I have my views, but I'd rather not share.
That's fair. That's fair.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Well, Tom has asked a better question of, was there a reason or explanation given for said exclusion?
Not really. And the family, because I was involved with the family when the review was published, the family were not unhappy with the review. It has been heavily, not redacted, but edited to exclude a lot of personal information that shouldn't be in the public domain, but may have relevance. I think the concern at the time from both the family and the school was that there would be an attempt to perhaps to place blame on the school for a lack of care. Was it a response to bullying that he took his own life? And in fact, that didn't. There's a sense of relief that didn't happen, and in fact, no real criticisms of what happened in the school at all. Although because I then went and worked in the school, I found some significant concerns about the way the critical incident was managed. Now, that's not relevant to this because that comes afterwards. But I was also concerned about the impact on the welfare of staff, mental health of staff, of dealing with this, the lack of, there didn't appear to be a crisis management plan in place. It was only a small school, and I think that exercise of developing a crisis management plan is something that should be done, but you just keep your fingers crossed and hope that it doesn't happen. But one of the learning lessons that when I conducted a review of the way the school had dealt with things, what became clear to me is that the senior managers were traumatized and had been traumatized for a period of time, which had impacted on the working of the school. Not to the degree that children were unsafe, but it had impacted. And I came to the conclusion that if a serious incident occurs, one of the things that must be done is you need to protect one senior manager. They need to be kept apart from the whole thing so that they are, in a sense, untainted by the risk of trauma, so that they can, for the sake of the organization, they can manage the organization. But that's, in a sense, a separate set of issues. But there was this feeling at the time, there's a real fear that the authority, because they'd made the critical decision about not allowing funding just before the young person took their own life, they obviously felt vulnerable to the criticism that had caused, in a simplistic way, that had caused the suicide, and a sense of a real power imbalance. And it doesn't help, that sense of a power imbalance, when the family and school are not included in the review. So I'll leave it at that. We could go on, but and of course, what doesn't come through is anything about what I think is probably the elephant in the room, which is about were budget constraints part of the decision making to not allow the placement to continue, and if so, was the right decision taken? Do educational officers need more flexibility when they're dealing with an issue like this, to say, look, I think we need to be cautious about withdrawing the funding and not allowing the placement to continue. But did they feel comfortable and confident? I suspect not. If you can move on to the next slide, because I know I'm running out of time and you're going to bark at me. So yeah, multiple and complex factors, heightened vulnerability and risk, and particularly at critical transition time. I don't think it was recognized just how significant this transition was on the back of the previous transition. And perhaps that lack of the sense that, well, he's going to college one day a week, so he can go full time. It doesn't really, particularly for an autistic person with complex mental health, doesn't really capture the level of risk involved. There was poor communication going on. There was silo working. And I come to this last one, for which I don't have an answer. but I think it's worthy of thought, is this idea of how, when you're a decision maker working in the local authority, you've got a very limited amount of time to allocate to any set of issues. How do you identify, how does a school, how does an education officer identify those really complex at-risk young people so that you can keep some sort of monitoring and intervention system in place? Next slide. So this is from the review. I won't read through it verbatim, but the term silo working come up. Key transition comes up. Harmful behaviours. Again, I wondered the degree to which we expect education officers, even additional support needs teachers, to this overlap area where you've got children who are, for example, self-harming, whether there's a level of expertise that's required that really necessitates interprofessional working at that point. It can't just be someone who's got an ASN qualification in dyslexia. How can they develop the expertise that may even elude the mental health professions, and yet this pressure is being put on them to intervene. Next slide. And so I leave you because I want to provoke a discussion. The voice of this came from the review itself. The voice of the child must be heard and reinvigorated, and children and young people need to be given the opportunity to be involved in decisions that impact on them and their families. So was this young person's voice really heard at the time that the decision was taken that he should leave the school? And the answer is probably no. It may have been relayed to the meeting, but did he have the chance to say, look, I really need to, I need to stay, I need some stability, I feel safe at school, I can't face at this stage moving on. So I think that's it, is it? Was that the last slide?
Yep, thank you so much, Bill. We're going to pause for a second before we go on break. We have a poll we would love you guys to take part in. So I'm just going to bring it up. So we are curious to know, as a practitioner, do you feel you can have these conversations with other professionals, with other interprofessional practitioners to support the people you work with? We'd love to hear your answers. This is anonymous, so don't worry about, if you're on with other staff members or whatever. And also, I think it would be interesting, Bill and Tom and Jean, if you feel that way.
Sure.
It's a big question, I think, but a very important one after.
Can I ask a secondary question to that point you've just raised, the question you just asked, Corey?
Yes.
And I suppose it goes a little bit wider, particularly for children and young people. Given that in Scotland we now have UNCRC incorporated into Scots law, do you think the implementation of said in practice will enable interprofessional practitioner discussions associated to these? And in short, I mean, if there's a little niggle or something of concern, you pick up the phone for an informal discussion with a colleague, perhaps of a different profession. You don't raise an immediate everything raising about how do you or how do you not take that forward in terms of it becoming a sudden instant protection issue. I'm talking about stuff that's a supportive issue.
I would say the answer is probably no, but depends on the nature of the working relationships that develop between individual human beings in organizations. It's not about the title of, although you probably need some seniority to be able to even go and speak to a child psychiatrist. But it's, are they available to take a phone call? Do you have their phone number? It's sometimes quite simple things like that. And I've clicked yes on that slide because in complex cases, I phone at people who are involved in Tier 4 mental health assessments down in England. It's easier through my connections to contact England than it is anyone up here. But I think that's a really important question that ought to be put to a lot of people working in CARMs, in education authorities, in social work departments in particular, in education, is here is a complex case. Here is a high risk case. What are you going to do? Mm-hmm. And if the answer is, well, actually, I don't know, I'm scratching my head, then there has already been a failure. Mm-hmm. There is some structural failure there. and it could be cultural, or it could be whatever, financial. But there is some failure there when there is an expectations that we work in silos. For all this talk about breaking down silos, if the expectation is that this is your job, you do it, and you don't have that network of personal and professional relationships in place, then that leads to a level of risk, I would suggest.
Thank you, Bill. And Richard has said two very interesting things that actually join on to both you, Tom and Bill. He said big questions, and the answer is yes, but. You know, it's the response of the other professionals, it's their availability, it's their willingness to take on more work. Yeah. It's, you know, retreating into the safety of your own silo is very difficult to resist. And I think certainly with the practitioners we're working with and the frontliners that we are saying we're firefighting all the time. So, you know, when you know you're going to get a call from an individual which is potentially going to derail your next week of work, you know, that might be a huge barrier to you picking up that phone call.
Yep.
Which is alarming. So thank you for those who took part. So 5 people said yes, they do feel like they can have conversations with other interprofessional practitioners, and 1 person has said no. So thank you for that. It's interesting to see.
Is that Australia? I wonder if things are.
Good point. How is it different in Australia? Very good.
I will just message and ask them.
Okay, thank you.
I won't message and ask them. I know they can see it. Just message me your answer to that, please.
Okay. All right, guys, it's time to have a break, and we're on time, Bill. I am so impressed. I didn't even have to bark at you.
It won't last.
So it is currently 10:53. How would you guys feel about coming back at 11 a.m. and we will start up again? So that gives us enough time to go get a cup of tea, do what we need to do, and I'll put that in the chat. And we will see you soon. Thank you so much for staying. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I hope people were able to get yourselves a cup of tea, stretch your legs, and Karen has said, I will be in the move again. I'm back on my phone, but apologies. Hope to hear the rest of it. Perhaps if not respond, no problem, Karen. The first talk raised some significant rights issues we have become aware of, so I will let them be in touch after to explore further. Okay, thank you very much, Karen. I will keep that in mind. Just gonna.
Sorry, guys, I'll just give you the collective feedback and what you thought, what the Australians think. They have
Yes,
similar
please.
challenges, but they try to triage their workloads in a way that avoids escalation of a situation.
Wow.
Now, I can only imagine, and perhaps this is a question to go back to them, that will only add different and significant time-challenging pressures.
Mm.
Mm.
And I would like to know how they manage them.
Mm-hmm. Please do let us know. Wonderful. Okay, Jean, it is your time to shine once again.
Am I on then?
You're on now, yes.
Great. Well, good morning, and I'd like to begin by thanking the team for inviting me to contribute to what is clearly an important discussion on interconnectedness. And what I'll do is describe the work as an independent reviewer in relation to the Margaret Flemming Significant Case Review, which you can get in its full form and its summarised form and its easy read form on the Inverclyde Council website. I thought I'd say who was involved before I began, really, given that that was part of what Bill was talking about. So in my case, I got to know Margaret's mum really well, her dad's fiance and daughter and other members of that family, her friends, the professionals who knew her and who had worked with her across education, health, social work and within the voluntary sector. And then, because Margaret's no longer with us, some extensive work on getting the views and experiences of people with learning disabilities today. So set up a group with People First Scotland and a kind of advisory panel to me, and we met monthly and discussed the issues as they were arising. Also worked with PAMIS in Dundee because of its work with people with profound disability, because of the vulnerability that can be created because of that. And with the Scottish Commission for Learning Disability, who were doing an extensive piece of work for government at that time on the human rights of people with learning disabilities. And finally, a small group in Inverclyde of people who were living in Margaret's area now, to ask them what their experiences were, what quality they thought their lives had, and what they thought might improve those lives further. Well, underpinning all of that, although I was the reviewer, I had a review team consisting of key officials. There was a chief officers group above that. There was the Child Protection Committee and the Adult Protection Committee. So that's the cast of characters, if you like, that were involved in the review that I undertook. What I'd like to do now is kind of take you through briefly through Margaret's life, who responded to her during her life in terms of family and friends, education, social work and health staff. And then I'll provide my take on how it was in terms of collaboration and effectiveness of services and what that means for individuals and families now, particularly in these times of relentless cuts. And I'll end with some observations on the interconnectedness and my experience of undertaking the review. Those who collaborated wholeheartedly in what was an appreciative inquiry approach, I'll say a little bit about that later. And those who appeared invested in what I'll describe as more traditional outlooks and the implications for that for service improvement. So to Margaret and her life then. She was born in November 1980 and was the only child of Margaret and Derek Flemming, who lived in Inverclyde. They'd been in an acrimonious marriage for around 7 years when Margaret came along, and they eventually divorced. Both parents tried to stay together for Margaret's sake, but ultimately that wasn't possible. Significantly, there are no pictures of Margaret as a baby. She was never formally diagnosed as having a learning disability, but was treated as if she was, because there were initial suspicions that she had Soto's syndrome, which is a genetic condition, for those who are unaware, that's characterized by excessive growth and weight and learning disability. And that initial diagnosis was discarded very early on, but continued to be in her records and just taken as an assumption for all of her life, which was significant in her getting benefits from the DWP. Added to which, available records are at times contradictory, because I sourced as much of that as I could through a lot of help from Greater Glasgow and Clyde. In terms of her early development, she was seen regularly, but then nothing in between, and no sense of progression in between. They would indicate at maybe a 6-monthly review, oh, Margaret's fine. The next 6-monthly review, Margaret's not fine. And so it went on, but no joins. Margaret's mother had had a difficult labour with Margaret, and that may have contributed in part to her inability to bond with her. She said things like, Margaret's mum said things like, I liked her well enough until Margaret began to assert herself, which happened incrementally from about 4 onwards. Social work involvement began with a request for a nursery placement, and that was about helping Margaret communicate and socialise with others, and that was provided. No records remain of that, so it's not possible to know what progress she made in the nursery. She then progressed to both mainstream primary and secondary school. Some of her educators said she might have made more progress had she been in specialist provision. As it was, she bumped around at the bottom of the mainstream in terms of attainment, and may have been more motivated had she been near the top in specialist provision. Her dad took a very active interest in her education, and in terms of behaviour, there's consistent observations right across education, health and social work about her. The first is that she had a tendency to blend into the background, to be shy. And I think there begins her invisibility, which is a theme throughout her life. But she also had the capacity to be sullen and occasionally to have angry outbursts. Margaret's mum has said that she found her level of aggression intimidating, and it certainly seems to have escalated after her dad died. When her parents separated, her dad was her principal caregiver, and he was granted custody, and that was a couple of years before they divorced in 1993. Part of the basis for the custody case is that Margaret's mother is alleged to have hit her, although this was never subject to any investigation at that point. In 1992/3, Margaret's father began a new relationship, and that was with someone that Margaret grew to trust. However, she lost her dad relatively suddenly before her 15th birthday, at a time when her maternal grandparents, with whom her and her dad had been living for the last few years, had failing health themselves. So she had to go to live with her mum. and her grieving for her dad is not mentioned, not recognised. Her mum asks for social work support, and she's befriended by a social worker who stabilises the situation in that she helps mum to understand Margaret's behaviour in terms of adolescence rather than bereavement, and that she helps Margaret understand why her mum can become a bit frustrated by her from time to time. But it was more of a befriending, as we would describe it now, than a sort of social work professional intervention per se. So when the social worker goes on maternity leave, under a year after she'd started working with the family, like Bill's example, the case is closed because Margaret is shortly to start college, and it's thought that that'll be key to developing her independent living skills, so there's no need for the befriending component to continue. Mr. Flemming's fiancée tries to get access and is told that this is not possible. She's told that by social work, she's told that by legal advice. Margaret already knew Eddie Kearney and Avril Jones, her so-called carers, who were friends of her dad's, because they used to run a hotel that Mr. Flemming went to socialise, and Margaret was accepted there too. So when Mr. Flemming died, Kearney and Jones offered Margaret's mum support in the form of respite. They did that at Derek Fleming's funeral, and she gratefully accepted. She regarded them as good friends initially because of the support they offered. Now that respite became more frequent and more prolonged until Margaret was eventually living with Kearney and Jones on a full-time basis, and her benefits were switched to Avril Jones as her carer. Margaret's mum tried to get her back. She did that in a variety of ways, which I can discuss, but for the time reasons won't at the moment, as did Margaret's dad's fiancée. They both went to where Margaret was living, and they were both subject to violence from Eddie Kearney. He intimidated them verbally, but in Margaret's mother's case, physically as well. So that ultimately involved the police in one visit to assess the situation, and Margaret said, "I want to stay where I am." It was recognised she had a learning disability, but the interest was to see if there had been any criminality, any assault. And as Margaret's mother admitted that she gave as good as she got verbally, then that case never came to anything, and so the status quo was maintained. So stay she did, Margaret. She stopped college midway through a 2-year course that she was clearly enjoying. She made friends, and she had friends who remember her fondly. And one of the reasons for withdrawal was that Eddie Kearney said that she had been raped there. The college have no recall of that allegation, and the police have never found any evidence to substantiate it. So Margaret was withdrawn, and that was really her last mainstream contact with society, living in a cottage on a strip of land with a river on one side and a very busy road on the other, where she truly became invisible. It's thought she died there round about the Christmas of 1999. No one noticed that she'd gone until some 16 years later, and it was the DWP that noticed when introducing the new PIP scheme. By then, over £180,000 had been embezzled. So that's a very brief précis of a unique life, a life that was not that unusual until her father's death led to some seismic changes. What it's telling us about who communicates with whom to what end is significant. What does it tell us about what's effective and what's not? My report acknowledges that all of this happened a long time ago. It acknowledges that much has changed, but here's my take on some of the issues. How Margaret was perceived and treated is the first thing. No formal diagnosis, a label of a syndrome that was disregarded but always remained on her notes and how she was seen. A health professional made that call, but others ran with it and never questioned where it had stemmed from or its current validity. She was big. She was hospitalised because of her size and her weight. And when she was in hospital, which happened a few times, her weight dropped and then increased on discharge. There was no focus on the underlying causes that can be described as environmental. Her dad ate a lot, her grandparents ate a lot. Exercise and nutrition wasn't top of their agenda. And had there been a potential assessment around parenting as it would happen nowadays, maybe what was going on with the food issues would have been a red flag that would have led to the recognition of much more other significant things. The biggest thing about the records is there's no evidence that she was asked for her views on her life until she was befriended by that social worker for some months. No one to help her understand her own adolescence, and no one to help her modify her behaviours when she was aggressive rather than assertive. And no one to offer her the thought that she could live independently. I still believe she would just have turned 44 last week. I still believe that she could have lived independently and have had some kind of voluntary experience, friendships, fun. I think all of that was possible for her. So more fundamentally, when her dad died, social work, the befriender, didn't know that. She never knew that her dad had just died. Margaret never shared it. Margaret was staying with her mother. It was assumed that the divorce meant Dad was no longer in contact. No one made the join between some of Margaret's aggressive behaviour and her grieving. And in talking to the different disciplines and the way that I've described, much like what Bill said, education didn't know what social work was doing. Education and health didn't know what each other was doing. And so they couldn't make a concerted contribution to Margaret's life. So to findings overall, they're in the report, but to scan through some of the main ones. Corey, I think I'm okay for time still, yeah? So Margaret's life was not unusual. It was key events in her teenage years that exposed her to the dangers from which she could not protect herself. I think had her dad lived, it's highly unlikely that she would have died. Her invisibility is a big thing at the time of her death. The two neighbouring houses, which were like next door and next door again, didn't know that Margaret had ever lived beside them. Didn't know. She was exploited by her so-called carers for financial gain, and they abused her. We'll never know what Margaret wanted. Did she want to stay where she was, as she told the police? Or did she want to spend some time with her mother? Did she really make a choice, or was she controlled? Was all of that coercion? And I very much suspect it was. The carer status of Kearney and Jones went totally unchallenged by anyone. They were never assessed. The DWP accepted Jones as a carer because all you need for DWP purposes is someone to take the money and make sure that the money you get is appropriately spent. So she met that bar, and that was the boundary of that silo, to use Bill's words. And one GP who met the carers, who was in fact an excellent GP, met Margaret with them, and he saw that she was so much slimmer. And he thought, these carers are doing a good job. They've taught her about nutrition, and look how good she looks now. And it never occurred to him that there was anything other. But probably the thing that I found the most difficult to deal with on a personal level, going through all of this, was that people visited Margaret, family and friends of Kearney and Jones, and they saw her with tubes round her arms. They saw her with blue duct tape round her wrists where she couldn't get circulation. They saw her self-harm. They saw her shouting from a window in a room that she was locked in because she was being punished, and they did nothing. Absolutely nothing. Margaret's mother, her dad's fiancé, and the wider family have all been deeply, deeply affected. Margaret's mum is just an ordinary woman that you would meet anywhere. She would admit that she probably wasn't the best mother she could be. She was far from the worst mother, very far from that. And professionals who knew Margaret have been deeply affected too. One person who missed an opportunity to find out what was going on 7 years before she did, in recognising her contribution to that. Margaret was already dead, so it wouldn't have changed anything really in terms of the quality of Margaret's life. But this person was so affected that she moved into work that was all about improving the quality of life for all our Margarets. And she's done that in a dedicated way ever since. I know that one of the police persons involved on Margaret's birthday every year contacted Kearney and Jones to say, right, where is she? Every year. So her legacy goes on. The specifics on the agencies. The DWP continued to provide benefits for over 16 years without seeing Margaret at all. The Margaret's too scared to see you was one of the things that was accepted, but their policy and procedures do not require them to have seen a person. And Margaret almost gets lost in the health service because she's not so complex that she has to be noticed. So she's got clinics here and there and bits and pieces, but they don't cohere in any way. And her adverse childhood experiences, as we would define them now, and not a phrase that was used then, go largely unrecognised. No health professional ever raised any child protection issues. Education, the educators cared about her. Lots of educators cared about her. One said she loved her, and that love certainly showed in her actions. The college experience was the most positive one. There was a real sense that she was accepted, that she developed, and that she had meaningful friendships and experiences. Social work is more complex, it's very mixed. Positives and missed opportunities. The police involvement was narrow, as I've said, and focused on that one interaction with a visit to Kearney and Jones. When there are findings like these, the typical expectation is that a list of recommendations, as Bill said, will follow, and you could write them before you start. But it was obvious that not all authorities are in the same stage of evolution. And so you could write a tick box, do this, do this, do this, and find that 20% of authorities would have done most of them. So what good is that? So what I'd asked for was that each local authority does its own benchmarking of where are we at in relation to this person's life? What are we doing well? What have we not thought about? What can we do better? So a customised plan of action. But there are inevitably some brief recommendations. Local implementation groups, having a national audit, those of us who've worked with adults for a long number of years, you can look to the Borders case and go, what changed? Is Margaret's story very different? Answer no. Using appreciative inquiry as an approach. I love it. Practitioners love it. But when the findings move up the hierarchy, and certainly to the legal domain when you're publishing a document, it is not that simple. For structural reasons, political reasons, cultural reasons, and I'll stop there for that. Something about reviewing how someone gets a learning disability diagnosis in the first place. That every discipline should question that when they see it on a piece of paper. Who said when? What are the interventions that are linked to that? And learning the lessons from workflow and comms breakdowns. Continuing adult support and protection, because at the time I was writing this, there was the Scott review, and there was a possibility that it would be just melded in with that review. And Scott decided that there was merit in keeping it separately, but it needs to be reviewed on the basis of some of the cases that have come up. And one of the big battles was to get all the records I had available to the public, and they're on that site. But that took me a year of negotiation, and I use that word politely. Also think about Scottish Government in relation to this. The existing methods of community engagement and policy development so that the voices of people with learning disability and their families are truly heard and truly responded to. A recommendation about getting annual health checks for people with learning disability. We've done it before and it's stopped for some of the reasons that Bill's alluded to. But at least we would proof of life on an annual basis then. That very basic thing, if nothing other. And then there's some pleas about transitions, and Bill's covered some of that anyway. But what was to happen in Parliament folded, and a bit of mapping of local services, who's doing what for whom. So I'm going to close now, Corey, you'll be pleased. It's a year on since the report was published. This is the first time I've been asked to speak about it.
Really? Sorry,
I am unclear about its impact. I know it's been used by some. I don't know the extent of its use. So I'm unable to let you know whether the title of the report is being fulfilled, it being Remember My Name.
Thank you so much, Jean. I really thank you. That's so insightful. I think the fact that, just like Bill, you led with compassion, which is an incredibly important thing. And I think certainly with the community of practitioners, we do remember her name. I think it's important that not only we remember her name, but we identify that there are many Margaret Flemming still in this world, you know. When you just said there that she would have been 44 last week, that got me, because you know I have an autistic brother who could have been a Margaret Flemming, and he's 48. He's older than her, and it's wild to think that she was forgotten. So,
as you will know from the opening of the report, one of the adult protection trainers in Inverclyde, doing some in-service, begins by saying, what child protection individuals can you remember? Baby P, Mariah Caldwell, and a number of names will come up. But then you ask, name the adults. And Margaret now appears. But who else is in people's memories and in their hearts and their souls about how unacceptable in our society what she endured is.
Can I make a couple of points. One is sort of, again, a rhetorical question about the named person scheme, which was the Scottish government tried to put through and then had to withdraw because of a challenge from a Christian group. And I see both sides of it. It's a shame Maria Galley isn't here because she was an expert on that legislation and some of the issues that arose from it. But you wonder if, in my case, the lack of one person with an oversight was an issue, and it sounds like the same is true in the Margaret Flemming case. That if there had been, for all the legal difficulties about information sharing, would that named person have been able to stop happening what was happening? You know,
I suppose for me it would depend on who that named person was.
Yeah, so it's actually the quality of
yes, and what they saw as their role being. So if it was a further education lecturer, they wouldn't be visiting Margaret's home. So, you know, there'd be, you know, you were talking about silos, and I was thinking, well, where's the limit to non-silo working? When does it become so ethereal that we forget our own discipline in the midst of that too? So the named person is kind of an overlaying of that for me. Like if it's a child and you're a primary school teacher and that child's in your class, then you've got far more sense, even although you're focusing on being an educator about what's going on in that child's family. They come in without food, they're tired, their hair's not been combed, their clothes smell, all those indicators that trigger more of your involvement.
I think it gets much more difficult at secondary school level, because I've worked in secondary school as a principal teacher of support, and I was quite shocked at the lack because we used to have guidance departments and guidance teachers who tried to mop up some of these cases and were just swamped because they were, you know, had UCAS forms to fill in and everything else. And the kids definitely under the radar, but just because of workload pressure. So the idea of named person, it sounds good, but in practice, are the resources there? Is the willingness really there? But the second point I wanted to make, Jean, was that is to look at differences between our two case studies, because I think in yours, I was saying that there's probably not one single intervention that could have changed outcomes. I'm saying it was a set of complex risks that weren't fully appreciated, perhaps, but there wasn't one thing that could have been done to have averted what happened. I think in your case, it's different. I think there's something that comes through about very significant opportunities missed at critical stages. And so whilst we're dealing with cases which have some similarities, there are differences with respect to what might have been done. And in the case of Margaret, I think the conclusion is her death was avoidable. And whereas the conclusion in mine, I wouldn't go so far as to say that.
There are some fantastic people who work in Inverclyde now, who, as Margaret's life has become known, have really taken on board what they can do. And some of the individuals who lead educational provision have worked really hard at identifying every child with additional support needs and tracking them actively.
Yeah. But I would also say there's a role, and I put it in the comment section, about morbidity and mortality in the learning disabled population, because I had to do a piece of work on this for the Royal College of GPs, reviewing their training, and the training's there. It's very, very good training, but it's online and you don't have to do it. And the curriculum for training GPs is so cramped that they don't get very much opportunity to do it. But in terms of a systemic change, then anyone with a learning, intellectual impairment or learning disabled diagnosis, there ought to be perhaps some form of, even if it's just annual screening, and taking obesity is very much, you know, very common, and taking dental care, weight and nutrition. It's not a very complex thing to do, but if it's not being done, then there are going to be more Margaret Flemings, and inevitably they're already there. So perhaps there is an issue about GP involvement in this.
Yes, the GPs that knew her did all the routine stuff until she moved away. And the safeguard that's been put in place now is if you move from one area to another and the onus rests with you to sort your GP, you know, to get the next new GP for you. If you do not do that now, there's a trigger that alerts admin staff to why you've not done that, and it's followed through until you're found and you go and do it yourself. You move on to the next GP practice. But at the time that Margaret moved to live with Kearney and Jones, that trigger didn't exist. I mean, computerization of health records was a very elementary stage in her area.
Yeah.
One of the senior partners in that particular practice was a bit ambivalent about the value of computerization. So it took a long time for that to happen.
Jona's made a comment, and I don't know, Corey, whether now is the time to perhaps I'm very interested in the term soft risk assessment and what that actually means in practice. And I wonder if that's something we should deal with at the end.
Yeah, I think that would be a really good idea. And I think it's very interesting, Jean and Bill, you talking about how the individual could make such a difference. But I also think the circumstances and the setting, you know, I'm thinking about when I used to be a primary school teacher. And when I was working in affluent areas, you could immediately figure out the child who was coming in hungry, who had, you know, but then when I worked in really deprived areas of Glasgow, you were looking at a third of the children coming into school hungry.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's how do we support the practitioners within their training and with their continual learning to spot the difference between a child who is hungry because mum can't afford to give us food versus a child who is hungry because there is a much more severe form of neglect. So I think that's a really important point to point out as well, that and as cost of living continues to grow and the crisis continues to grow, I think it will become potentially harder and harder to identify. So thank you so much, Jean, for that. I really, we all appreciate you talking about it. I think it's incredibly, and it's so well written. I don't know if I've ever said that to you, Jean, but it's so beautifully written. So thank you for coming along today. And please feel free if you want to share today as well. A couple of comments that have said, Tom says, what about honesty and moral reasons? Fair, Tom. You know, we're here talking about avoiding disconnect, but where does morality fall into that? And then you've already said, Bill, about morbidity and mortality in LD populations as well. Yep. So thank you very much. Okay.
Can I come in on something that
go for it?
I will acknowledge I have a vested interest in this because I am a single parent of an autistic daughter, have been since she was 5-year-old, she's now 29, and I would not want anything like this. And those of you that have worked with me will know wholeheartedly, I would not want anything like this ever to happen again. And I think with some of the things that's been developed over time could play a significant role in this. And I think that the benefits of the wishes and view creation that I created for my daughter together to make sure those were brought on board, the fact that those were incorporated into a TAC meeting but then subsequently moved as she transitioned to adult services and support, they were incorporated into providing evidence that was useful in terms of self-directed assessment, supporting me as a guardian, being able to support information that I'm doing what I should be doing, so to speak, and all these things I think are significant steps forward. However, the question is, how do we ensure greater awareness, connectivity and all of that? And one bit that really comes to the fore in relation to key comments, and this is about visibility and awareness, and this goes back to something that came up while I was involved with the autism strategy, that the recognition of a key information summary that we can get put on the system with our GPs, that now that in turn surely would also trigger the need for constant review and so on and so forth. But a lot of people in society are not aware of that. Does it still exist? Yes, it does. It's not well used though, which is a weakness in my opinion.
And Tom, how would you feel about me adding that resource that you have used with your daughter and I have now used with my brother?
I will need. I'm actually regretting it now. I should have had a blank one on the wall for a sample, or at least a copy available. And
we can share it.
Hindsight, we used that, and we used it in part in the example that I'm coming on to. Hindsight's always right when you realise you missed something, isn't it?
That's okay. That's okay. Well, what I'll do is I can attach it as an example at the end of these slides so that people can have a copy of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. We're weirdly kind of on time, so thank you very much, everyone. I still haven't had to bark at anyone. Tom, it is
Are you wanting me to change that?
I'm all right. I'm all right, thanks. Okay, Tom, it is your time to shine now. Would you like to tell us about your case study with consent? So you have consent of V and her family in Australia. We do have people in Australia currently watching this, and we really appreciate their time because it's very, very late out there. So yeah.
Yeah, okay. I will say that V, her mum and dad, are both watching this, and they've all been told if they've got something to say it. My only bit that's kind of annoying at the minute, we didn't have the time to, when they realised they couldn't access Zoom, we didn't have the time to identify a way of getting them access to Zoom. So it's a bit of a jiggery pokery getting stuff around. So we over the last few days we've tried to pull together. Well, actually, over the last 24 hours, actually, we've tried to pull together some stuff that makes meaning more relevant. So one will do one's best. The first slide is really how this came about, which was really, and personally, I thought was a bit odd. I'm 14,000 miles or thereabouts away. Why am I being asked to get involved in this? And I'm in the wrong page. Hang on, I need to go backwards. My bullet point notes are in the wrong order here. I've lost a page.
While you're doing that, can I maybe read out a final?
No, got it. It's okay. Got it. Right.
Okay. Go for it.
Right. Okay. It was my mistake there. I forgot we pulled all our slides together, and I'm still on slide number 1 for me. Right. Okay. It's important to note that the case study summary is being delivered with the consent of the individual or family, and the emphasis here, partnering professionals. I've known Taylor Glenn, Australia, since November 2018, when he, along with Catherine McDodson from the US and Mikhail, I'm not going to try and pronounce this, but he's a Lithuanian, invited me to be the inaugural president of the International Advocacy Practitioners Association. He asked me to get Taylor asked me to get involved in this. I asked why. He answered what you can see on the screen, and further through this presentation, you will get the gist of the AISee approach, which is delivered within a code of ethics, principles and standards, professional advocacy, taxonomy of approach and learning, and a charter of well-being. So we stick to it. And the important thing going forward is we recognise the need to move from negative to positive. So if you can move on to the next one, Corey, please. Just for background information, Taylor gave V and her family some support in creating the next 2 slides. I'm not going to read them. I'll let you read them yourselves. They're basically a little bit of background and some explanation to the various challenges that they had. And further on, when we get to the comments that come from these families to where they're at now and what the process did for them, I think it becomes really relevant in the message that they are saying. And that is really about connecting and so on and so forth. And I think going through that, it's worth pointing out at this stage that the extreme rural Cohesion did not help them, with their nearest town being 300 kilometres away and their nearest specialist diagnostician services 2,400 kilometres away. So that in reality is a day and a half's travel. So there's situations in there that certainly did not help. And if you flick on to the next one, if everybody's read that, I'll give you a second or two to go through that one. And I hope both of them slides give you a little bit of sense of what is and where they feel they're at or not, as the case may be. And I'll shunt on to the next one now, if that's okay. The initial interface with V and her family was, in a nutshell, a listening and observational exercise utilising listening with eyes and seeing with ears. Now, that may sound daft, but when you connect the two together, it can be hugely informative and exceptionally when looking forward, and also when you deliver exploring questions and acknowledgements of appreciation, assurance, and understanding. One can get an exceptional insight into where a family is at. But that takes time. Time, unfortunately, that a lot of practitioners do not have in making real, often critical assessments. In total, that took me about 10 hours to work out where we're going next and what we need to do. However, in that, we agreed a number of things. But one thing that, sorry, before we move on, one thing that was very evident that from that overview was the family was dysfunctional and disconnected within the household, let alone anywhere else. And I questioned with myself, how long can this go on? Evident though was their love and support for one another. Also very evident was their lack of understanding and lack of targeted supports and opportunities for them as individuals and as a family unit. So how did we move forward? So yeah, we agreed a number of things, all deliverable within the AISee approach of, if you look in the yellow circle, sorry, the blue outline circle of CIHA, which is common interest holistic advocacy. And by that, we adopt person-centered approach, but take cognizance and recognition of everyone else around the individual. In theory being, if you get it right for the individual, you're getting a lot of other things right for everybody working with the individual or supporting the individual, whether that be a family or a practitioner. CPERG, Contributed Participating Engagement Resource Group. This initially was the family and Taylor. It grew to be me. It then grew as various other professionals and practitioners joined it. And through this process, we adopted IRL, #IRL, which is Inclusive Reflective Learning. And by connecting all of that and reflecting in all the discussions, we were better connecting everyone around what was what. And all of that is for PCP, which is Positive Collaborative Partnership. All of that is meaningful, but it has to be delivered in the context, person-centered approach, but connecting to everyone around the individual that's working with them, and in a manner that is timely, appropriately paced, so that nobody is getting lost in the journey or anything is getting missed on the journey, or you're reducing the risk of something getting missed on that journey of going from negative to positive. Plus, so we moved, sorry, Corey, just stay in that one for a second. You'll see there that we used our professional bodies to connect via, in my case, the International Advocate Practitioners Association and the Institute of Employability Professionals. And with an associate, one of my friends actually, a qualified psychiatrist, we managed to identify a qualified and registered diagnostician. So certain connections came in there. And plus other professionals defending on outcomes of assessment came on being through more localized knowledge to pull it together. And I was asked to continue for a little bit once we identified an advocacy practitioner to continue with a bit of oversight going on. And even now, I still have, every 4 to 6 weeks, I got a little bit insight of what's going on, which is really good. And I'm pleased to say things are still positive. We created an indicative overview of communication and senses, particularly around some of the challenges that we stated around taste, hearing, interoception, i.e. our own internal body awareness, and so on and so forth. And move forward to what's needed to staying safe, staying well, getting around, staying mobile, having things to do, opportunities around education, employment, and identify and maintain key relationships and support. All significantly relevant. Now, let me pose a question that is kind of reflective on the previous 2 case studies. Where do you think that breakdown of what we were identifying, the overview, came from? It was created in Scotland. It was created in Scotland to do with the development of self-directed support. It's actually the key components of, in a Scottish context, an adult outcome-focused assessment. So we kind of married that up to try and deliver something that could be useful for V and her family. And subsequently, I can confirm that practitioners in Australia found that very useful as well. So that in itself was a leap forward. Next one, please, Corey. Transitioning from negative report, it was evident that our work was cut out, significantly evident. So we proceeded with V and family where we could, with and in a timely manner, to avoid overwhelming them, and to give those who were coming on board to be part of Team V the opportunity to establish a connection and relationship with V and their family and other partnering professionals. In particular, if you look at the diagram on the left of your screen, You see where there was no connections, but again, this is because of the rurality, lack of being able to connect to who they needed to connect to, and so on and so forth. So what we did next was we took the information that we had garnered and considered what we could be done using UNCRPD as a light touch and a soft guide. Why? Simply because with UNCRPD had been UNCRPD had been incorporated into aspects of Australian practice and legislative frameworks. We used our professional body connections to introduce refer as appropriate for advocacy, diagnosis, and more, which I said previously. We kept the individual at the centre and family fully included all the way through the journey. Due to the family's extreme rural location, we identified after several weeks a visiting advocacy practitioner by the name of Lottie Watson, and she is watching this today. In fact, she actually gave a statement earlier for linking in, which has been posted on the chat. Thank you for that. We got a short in-care residential assessment, which ultimately diagnosed, gave the diagnosis and some co-occurring co-occurring conditions, but did not highlight an LD diagnosis, but highlighted an LD need. Now, there's a distinct difference in there, and I'm coming back to that later on when we move forward, because that is absolutely significant. And why do I say that is significant? Because all too often we get a label, and our processes and practice take us down a label. So in this instance, getting the wrong LD here would have been considerably risky and in many ways potentially irrelevant for V. And we provided where appropriate, and they took up some of our AISee FITOL accredited skill enhancement training. Shunt on to the next one. I'm going to get through this in no time. I like this. It was evident, 39, 40, 41, right? But there was no set. If I go down the slide on the left, the part on the left here first, we started off with, let's go down to diagnosis. We'll start there and get a bit of continuous there. Off at 5 o'clock, if you like, looking at that slide. Diagnosis, LD, autism, and she got a diagnosis of autism. LD is there. She's also got a bit of ADHD in there, and she's now got some community psychiatric support as well. And married to that, she's also, if you go diagonally opposite, you'll notice there she's got some counselling sessions, which she gets fortnightly to support and help her understand herself better, and so on and so forth. Now, LD, but which LD? Why does this matter? What does LD stands for? Anybody?
I mean, usually it's learning disability.
But in this instance, it's not. It's a learning difference, and that is significant, because one of the things that came out from everything that had been done previously, including the diagnosis, was that V is capable of learning, but it's visual learning. And she's very good with her hands, very good at pulling stuff together. So don't hand her a manual that says, do this. Hand her some straight visuals and she'll go off with it. That in itself is a but she's intellectually enough with various other aspects in life, she can cope. So there was no consensus that an LD diagnosis, learning disability diagnosis, should be there. So going on, we managed to link her in with community education. She's now moving forward with some form of education, because she missed a lot of school, substantial amounts of school, and getting support with that. A lot of it is online, and some of it is every now and again. I can't remember the frequency. Somebody tell me, please. I know you're listening. Of when she goes to the 300 kilometers to the nearest centre to get some additional in practice support, face-to-face in practice support. Through the local advocacy practitioner, we were able to secure online befriending and support activities in conjunction with social care input and local knowledge there. We're equally able, we got some input from SLT and OT, which was basically a one-off assessment from each that concluded there was no need to go forward other than to create a communication mode that suited V to support her learning and practice. She can speak fairly well, but it was the processing issues around that learning that needed addressed, not the actual learning itself. She has 2 local placements in terms of employability, which is hugely significant, and indeed both the employability partners are attending today. And she's got advocacy with Lottie that she has a fortnightly session there now as well. It was weekly until things got settled. And the family as well, they have parental awareness and communication and training, and they too are linked into various networks that they weren't before. So what is this done in such a very short period of time for that family? It's only been 11 months, which in a Scottish context that would not happen in 11 months, far from it, let alone a UK context. So this was in a nutshell luck, because we had professional body connections, we had how to interact with those different people in different parts of the globe, but more importantly than that, there was a team of people who came together. And through what was said earlier by one of them about prioritizing their workload to prevent escalation, this is a prime example of just doing that. There wasn't a huge amount of input required from every individual professional going on very quickly, but there was the need for them all to contribute one way or other to assessing how they can or cannot help. And that in itself has also removed the initial perception that you would get from looking at this as a first timer coming at this case. The immediate thing you see is, oh, blimey, this is high. This is going to be high cost, high intervention, all the rest of it. In reality, when you work it through, it's low cost, literally low cost. And the reason it's low cost is because of inclusion, inclusive reflective learning, the cohesion, the joining up, and just going by what's said there. And I can take no credit for the comments on the right-hand side. Taylor helped them do this. In fact, I think they did most of it themselves. Taylor probably helped, or Lottie helped V to support. She's now more included, more settled, happier, growing in ability and confidence, and so on and so on. I'll let you read down there. And the bit at the bottom, how were we able to be so expedient? It's because we got the connection in place at the right time, and above all, and more importantly, we got a practitioner who's prepared to give you 5 to 10 minutes to listen. And that in turn helped them prioritize. Perhaps we can do something quickly without anything, and so on and so forth, without anything escalating, and pull it together. And I remember the first team around V discussion that we had. I personally was overwhelmed by the cohesion, the understanding that they all had, and realization that each of their contributions made in a timely manner at appropriate pace could have significant impact. Outcome driven, without a shadow of a doubt, outcome driven, individual focused, but also team inclusive. And that team inclusive is the non-professional and the professional. And the AISee approach and our hashtags, we were able to have an inclusive, transparent, non-professional and interprofessional, collective, person-centered, family inclusive interface with timely, preventative and supportive interventions that had impact, meaning and matter. Going on from that, comments from V and her family, their own words, I merely put them onto the slide for presentation. The collective V's, the acknowledgements from all Team V, basically. I will once again let you read them. If we're okay with that, we'll shunt on. So I kind of keep to time, so you don't have to shout to me, Connie. The summary of the positive outcomes: person-centered, family-connected. Excuse me. Incorporated step-by-step referrals and introductions and connections to professionals at an appropriate pace. Advocate to support V and family moving forward by ensuring considerations of, and that's the list I read out earlier. And I've already said what V's got in place, which long may that continue. It seemed positive. I do know they are now reviewing some soft risk assessments to say, what if something goes wrong? How does it go wrong? What do we need to do about it? I can say with confidence they are not expecting any major drawbacks or fallbacks to anything going dramatically or seriously off the rails here, because things are moving forward in parallel with all together, in parallel and together. Sorry, it made by what we did collectively, made all the connections meaningful. It supported us as in Team V with accredited skill enhancement training, including autism and co-occurring awareness, autism and well-being, autism and self-directed transitions, person-centered planning, and a stress in there that should say adult person-centered planning, because V is close to 30 or just over 30, I can't remember exactly. Autism, ADHD, LD, and neurodiversity in employment, and the parental professional advocacy training, all of which was person-centered, outcome-focused. That's me.
I can't believe it, Tom. I can't
Bang
believe
on
it.
time. Told you I could go to a canter.
Yeah, you really can. I mean, I'm gonna put down let's pause here. But also I've just been thinking about some of the key themes. Is it all right if I share that with you, Jean and Tom and Bill, about what we've seen? And I think with Bill and Jean, what's very, and actually also with V, is the lack of early support and intervention. You know, how someone, until they were in crisis or until they were in real trouble, is when they were flagged up to the organizations that needed support. I also think that all three of them involved transitions, whether that was in education, whether that was in family circumstances, and also a lack of expertise in practitioner support, whether that's because of there's a rural issue that can be a real issue. Is it because someone is now in a brand new setting? Bill made the good point that, you know, often these staff members are incredibly passionate and compassionate. And I've been to Moorhouse, Bill, you know that. I've done training with them. Wonderful people, but often traumatized, you know, for what's been happening. And what was interesting is decisions for Bill and Jean's cases were made for the person rather than in conjunction with the person. And I think what was so powerful, Tom, about your work and everyone else's around V is that, you know, it was very person-centered. And I think that's why it has been successful. And also there's been inconsistent approaches. You know, Jean, you talk about the fact that there was a wonderful social worker at one point who wasn't really a social worker, was a befriender who got to know who Margaret was, you know. And for Bill, you had people at the school and you had who worked with the family who were there to support and were able to identify the needs and really advocate for that individual. But I think it was really positive, Tom, to end on V's case study, because I wrote down thriving versus surviving. And I think the fact that, first of all, the people who supported V are here together, I think that's incredibly powerful, because that shows that the disconnect isn't there, that there are people who want to take part in this, who want to see the case study, who want to learn about it. So the fact that they're here today, and for V, she is thriving, but for the other two case studies we're talking about, they didn't survive. And I think that's a really important, you know, if we're talking about outcomes and impact, if we can avoid the disconnect, it does in fact allow people to thrive and allow their families to thrive as well.
Yeah, can I come in and raise another point which I didn't emphasize at the time in my talk, but it's the family was a vulnerable family in my case study. I've talked about the mother having been in an abusive relationship. And I think that one thing that struck me over the last decade or more is that outcomes are often good for young people if the family does not feel patronized, but feels supported. And in some cases, that means that the professionals involved wag their fingers and say, do this, do that, and do the other. But families are often looking for advice on how to support young people, for example, with communication issues, with autism, with challenging behavior. But often they are sent on parent training programs, generic training programs, for example, which don't really address the issue. And it creates this political imbalance where they feel that they're being judged and rather than supported. So there is something there about the cultural barriers and the political barriers that mean that families themselves are not. I know I had a case study of which I had to do remotely, like Tom, of a young person in Abu Dhabi. And it was a bit of a crisis situation, college placement breaking down, situation at home breaking down. My recommendation was that the mother and the father took themselves off on holiday because the most important thing was the capacity of the family to support this very challenging young person, and they hadn't had a break. It had been full on. They needed to recharge their batteries. They also need to be told that they were doing a very good job under difficult circumstances, which no one had ever said before. And the other message that needs to come through is you will get through this. There is hope. There are positive outcomes. We just need to work through these stages in the way that Tom has done very systematically with his intervention, is that if you break everything down and indicate that there could be positive outcomes if we get things right, then it gives hope where at times people feel hopeless. So yeah, I think ending with Tom's case study is very encouraging, very, very helpful.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Okay, before you do the final comments, do you want me to read this out, Tom? The final comments from Fee's dad?
Yep.
Okay. Combined 11 months on, we are as individuals and a family in a far better connected place. Fee, for the first time in her life, is content and happy. Her brother now able to move forward with employment and PT study. My wife and I are now, for the first time in many years, relaxed and supportive of Fee, her brother, and each other. Key relationships, cohesive connections, and understanding with appropriate, meaningful support goes a very long way. What I was thinking when you guys were talking was that I wish that every vulnerable individual has a Tom or a Bill to advocate for them and push for them and identify risks and in the nicest way possible. I hope, Jean, you don't have to do another report like this. You know, I really hope that this is something of the past. We have an evaluation. Now, some people have had to leave due to time constraints, etc. But if you would like to do it, there is a QR code. So if you put your camera up to the screen, it should come up and say something like open in Chrome or open in Safari. And it is a very short evaluation form that kind of gives us an insight into your feedback on today's session. And we'll make sure we also share the evaluation link within our after training email. So before we leave, would you like to talk about this, Tom?
Yep, very briefly, I have the privilege of delivering 6 UNCRC implementation and professional advocacy practice webinars. We've done 4. Tomorrow I've got the one for North America, and on I think it's either the 19th or the 20th, I have the one for South America. And I finished them all with the comment in the little thought bubble. Professional advocacy practice is advocating that a system works for an individual, not molding an individual to the system.
Thank you. Thank you.
And sorry, I will add that membership of INTAPA is not just advocacy practitioners. It's made up of those that are in education, social care, health, anyone who has a main professional component, but they have a secondary component to their day job, which is advocating. So we are a very inclusive organization, and I have to admit we have some fascinating discussions that some just are not repeatable.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. Thank you. And as promised, here is a list of signposting for further resources on suicide and mental health support, bereavement, and violence, with domestic violence as well. So if any of the topics have upset you today or you would like to find more, please feel free to contact these organizations as well. I think that's it, guys. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We're on time / early, imagine that. Thank you so much for those who've been able to stay the whole time. We really appreciate it. You are muted, unfortunately.
One additional point, Corey. We
Yes.
will put the slide, we will PDF the slides and send them out to those that have registered. And it's also, the recording will also go on our new website, our updated website, once we get that finished.
Yeah, thank you very much. Anything else, Jean or Bill, you would like to add before we leave? Nope. Lindsay has said, thanks so much, everyone. Really interesting stuff. Looking forward to sharing with my colleagues. Yes, please, sharing is caring. We always love it when people spread the word of our work. Thank you so much. Okay, I think that's us for now. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and we will be in touch with our next webinar. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.